Raja goes, why does IRA definition prevent me, a Palestinian, from describing my treatment by the Israeli state as racist? Any Jew can return homeland after 2,000 years in the diaspora, but I can't after 70. How's that not racist? I think this is a great question. I think that's why a lot of Palestinians, we do have a lot of our Palestinian community members in the chat today, and they find this conversation very interesting. A conversation about anti-Semitism they find to be very interesting because they feel like the term anti-Semitism has been weaponized against them when they're giving what they feel is very legitimate criticism of Israel. Ken, I know you did mention that you do think the definition's been abused. Is it referring to this specifically?
Well, it's referring to the as Derek said, how it's been used. Again, there were reasons why the Israel examples, including double standards, and which we can talk about a little bit more, and things like holding all Jews collectively responsible for actions of Israel, and things like denying Jewish right to self-determination, e.g., calling the creation of Israel a racist endeavor. There was a reason why those things were included in the working definition, and I stand by them, because the definition was not to target any particular expression of somebody to say that they're an anti-Semite. Again, it was to take a temperature, particularly in Europe, over time and across borders, and we did see a correlation. I would never say a causation, but we did see a correlation between harsh criticism, including anti-Zionist criticism of Israel, frequently around, as we saw recently, hostilities with Hamas, or in other instances with Lebanon, with the other episodes. We did see an increase in hate crimes against Jews in cities. I had a colleague in the UK who used to have a graph of mentions of Israel in the press and that type of attitude, and attacks on Jews, and can almost superimpose them. So we thought that was an important data point. But what happened, and Derek knows this, I started seeing in 2010 precisely the types of problems that your questioner asked about. We started seeing on the campus the utility of the definition. In the U.S., there's a law that talks about you could defund colleges if they create a hostile, intimidating, discriminatory environment, and Jews were included as of 2010. You started having these right-wing Jewish groups saying, aha, here's somebody teaching something, here's somebody saying something, just like your questioner asked, and they started using that as the basis of challenges to try to defund universities, to suppress speech. So that was the beginning, I saw, of the abuse of the definition to go after individuals, which it was never intended to do. When I had, as you know, a recent book out called The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine campus debate, and one of the reviewers, who generally was positive of the book, had something that I thought was absolutely right to reckon with. He criticized me for saying basically, if it create a tool for hunting witches, don't be surprised if people use it as a witch hunt. And I think that's the problem. It's not the definition in how it was intended, it's the abuse of it in political ways that are really disgusting in my view.
So do you support reforming the definition in such a way that it can't be abused as easily?
No, that's part of my, I like aspects, and there are certainly things that are superior, I think, with the JDA definition. The Nexus definition I recommend as well. But I don't think it's a question I don't think definition should be used, say, on a campus, any definition. I mean, we wouldn't do that with racism. We wouldn't define racism as opposing affirmative action or opposing Black Lives Matter, or not being in favor of defunding the police, or keeping statues up. You wouldn't have a definition with examples like that and say, we're going to police speech, we're going to encourage administrators to stop speech. You would never do that. So it's a question of not the text of the definition. It's a question of it's been abused in a way that's problematic. And that should be, that's why I agree with Derek. There should not be any institutionalizing in this in a way that's going to restrict speech of people who want to criticize Israel, even harshly and even in an anti-Zionist way. But people have cited the definition to go after people that talk about Palestinian rights, and maybe even, in an anti-Zionist frame. That ought to be okay. That ought to be protected. It can be debated, but it should never be censored.
Would you like to hop in, Derek?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the difference between what's actually written on the paper and then how the IRA definition's been used. So the questioner is asking, why is it a problem for me as a Palestinian who has suffered from Israel to call Zionism racism? I mean, of course you have the right to say that. And one thing that the Jerusalem definition does is it simply says that there are things that people can say about Israel. Basically, as long as you're not employing anti-Semitic tropes, you're not talking about Jews controlling the media, you're not invoking languages of Jewish conspiracies, you're not attributing to Jews, unusually violent, evil sorts of tendencies or behaviors. If you're talking about the action of a state, the state of Israel, and then operative ideology, and we know what's happening on the ground, what's actually happening on the ground in the occupied territories, of course, people should be able to talk about that openly in a variety of settings. So this is something, again, that I found confusing about the IRA definition, where it says right at the beginning, and defenders of the IRA point this out over and over again, they say, well, the definition says criticism of Israel akin to that directed against any other country is fine. Well, okay, in the United States right now, there's a big debate about racism. There's a very powerful line of thinking in the United States that the country is structurally racist. This is a very important element behind BLM, Black Lives Matter, behind the 1619 Project, behind a variety of educational programs, that the United States is structurally racist. Now, there are other people who disagree, and it's become quite ugly in the United States, the debate about this. I'm in Canada, which is a much more low temperature sort of country in every way, but there has been a real debate in Canada for decades, if not centuries, about whether the countries should be one or two or three. I mean, there is a sovereigntist movement in Quebec historically that wanted to simply undo the country. And yet Quebecois separatists had the right to say Canada is an oppressive country and we have a right to our own country. People did not get thrown in jail or denied their free speech rights because they were separatists. We call countries throughout the world genocidal. We attack China for what it's doing to the Uyghurs. We attack Russia for invading, parts of Ukraine. We use all kinds of hostile language to describe countries the world over. So if we can criticize Israel the way we can criticize any other country, then we could call Israel racist. We could call Israel violent. We can call Israel oppressive. We can do all sorts of things. So again, I think that Ken has really put his finger on it. The IRA was really useful as a way of sort of identifying things that are happening on the ground and assuming, that might very well have been the result of anti-Semitism for data collection, but to actually try to limit speech because of it. Not only is it wrong in and of itself, it actually contradicts the wording of the IRA's own first couple of sentences. Criticism of Israel, akin to that leveled against any other country, is licit. Last but not least, South Africa was widely criticized for practicing apartheid until the early 1990s. Does this mean that one may call Israel apartheid? You don't have to agree that it's an apartheid country. Okay, you don't have to agree. But is it okay to say it? Because that kind of criticism has been directed elsewhere. So again, this is where I found the IRA kind of irritating. Because on one hand, it seems to be allowing all sorts of free speech that would give the Palestinian questioner and lots of others say about Israel whatever you want. And then it seems to be trying to take it away. And that seems to be illogical.
Ken, you're on mute.
I basically agree with Derek, but if I could add to it, that one particular bullet point of the working definition, I think, has been distorted from its original intent as well. It was intended to say, nobody would say of another democratic country that's getting rockets sent at them, they should just say, take it, we shouldn't do anything. I mean, you can argue about whether the response was appropriate or not, but nobody would say, that they shouldn't respond, which is what was happening, and some folks were saying. That was the genesis of that particular point. But people have been abusing it to say, well, if you're going to criticize Israel, why are you not also criticizing China and Tibet and all these other places? And, give me a break. When I was protesting for Soviet Jews, I wasn't, I was concerned about Tibet, but I didn't go to a protest about it. Did that mean that I was, being, racist or prejudiced about it? So again, this has been weaponized is the problem. And the larger frame, to me, is the question of how definitions of anything should be used. We tend to, and this comes from my day job as a hate studies center, we tend to, when we have issues that touch on our identity and touch on things that we feel very strongly as social justice issues, there's a lot of social science that says we want to make it simple, we want to make it black and white, we don't like difficult, confusing ideas. We just want to put it in a box and either forget about it or condemn it. And that's what's happening with the idea of the definition. People are talking about how do we define it? What are the differences? Is it anti-Semitic or is it not? And we're missing so much that's critical about the discussion of anti-Semitism. But of course, we're trying to reduce it into this little box. I'll give you one example. Derek was talking about the U.S. If you look back at the recent period of time in the United States when Trump was president, and certainly anti-Semitism long preceded Trump, people are talking about, did he say things about Israel, about Jews, whatever. You look at the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. How did that come about? That came about because there was a guy named Bowers who was concerned at the time that Trump was talking about immigrants coming up from Mexico. And he decided Jews are responsible for this happening because Hayes had a meeting. I'm going to go shoot Jews. So, you don't look at the fact that anti-Semitism increases when you have leaders talking about us and them and vilifying them as a danger to us, and not about Jews. He was talking about Muslims and he was talking about Mexicans. And you don't think about anti-Semitism when you look at the Walmart shooting. Nobody would count that on even the metric that the working definition has. But the shooter that went into there and shot Mexican Americans and Mexicans had the same exact ideology as Bowers in Pittsburgh. He just chose a different target. So I think by talking about, is it anti-Semitism under this definition or that definition or the competing definition, we're missing so much that's essential about thinking about how anti-Semitism works and therefore how we should combat it.
Ken, can I jump in there? Because that's something actually that I liked about the Jerusalem Declaration right from the start, which is I feel like what happens so much among people who care about anti-Semitism, and again, I want to reiterate, I'm worried about anti-Semitism, okay? I worry about the attacks against Jews in Los Angeles and New York and London, and as well as, obviously what's happened in Israel. So I'm not making light of it. It's a question of how you frame it. There was a terrible hate crime last week in London, Ontario, where a man, rented a pickup truck and he ran over a family of 5 Muslims, Pakistani Muslims, killed 4 of them. It was a vicious hate crime. And one thing that the Jerusalem Declaration is very aware of, the authors are very well aware of, and Ken is pointing out, is that we're talking about a common concept of hate. And whether it is anti-Black racism or various forms of xenophobia or anti-Semitism, they are connected. And this is a really controversial issue because what's happening so much in the United States now is the debate about racism, about BLM. They're not quite sure what to do with Jews. But there is a tendency to bracket off anti-Semitism because Jews, for the most part, and I'm really qualifying that, for the most part, are perceived as white. I'm being very careful about my language. And many of them are more affluent than the national average. So I'm not using anti-Semitic language here. I'm just talking about a fact about Jews as a community. However, Jews do experience anti-Semitism. They do experience hatred. They do experience vandalism, verbal abuse, and sometimes physical violence. And it's very important for those who want to combat anti-Semitism to realize that this is not different from, this is part of a general struggle against racism. And this is a conversation we have to have within the Jewish community, within people who care about race and about hatred in general. And that's something that I think I'm afraid Jewish institutions have resisted. And there has been that tendency to see, to look at, for example, the more progressive members of the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives as somehow hostile to Jews or There are differences of opinion, but we are dealing with a common problem, and we have to work together at a common solution.